Hello everyone, welcome to another geography video. I'm going to show you today how to evaluate the impact aid has had on an NEE or LIC you have studied. So hopefully you've come through this either during your revision or on the QR code on your work booklet. This is actually the last question in your work booklet, so well done for getting this far. It's a really interesting question, and it's one that we always must keep in mind when looking at the impact of international aid, so the help and the money that different countries or governments or companies have and have given to poorer countries that are looking towards development. So we are obviously studying Nigeria, and I thought the best way to look at a question like this is to first of all look at the positive aspects, and I'm just going to put a little plus there for positive. And then we'll look more in depth as well at the negative aspects, and we'll actually have a quick look at a case study as well. So some of the positive things that come out from providing aid, especially to Nigeria, is to kind of alleviate this over-dependence on oil. Okay. Nigeria especially has, well, first of all, it has extremely large oil reserves, some of the world's largest. And so its economy is very much based on on oil that's available there. So, for example, over the past 5 years, there's been a global dip in oil price, and that's had a massive impact on the economy in Nigeria. So this over-dependence on oil is a particularly dangerous thing, and by providing aid, we can stop doing that. Okay. The next thing is protecting against HIV and AIDS. Which is particularly prevalent in large parts of Africa, and especially Nigeria. And the next thing, which I think is really important, is providing and setting up community care projects. And we'll have a quick look at one of those in a second. Okay, so there's just some positives, and we kind of glossed through that quite quickly, but they're the main positives really that Nigeria has felt through international aid being given to them. There are, of course, some negatives, and one of them is, and especially in Nigeria, unfortunately, is an element of corruption. So we're going to put corrupt governments. This really has a big impact because that money, that international aid that is accepted by Nigeria, struggles to find its way to trickle down to some of the poorest in the society, and so that has a really negative impact on the whole aid process, aid cycle. Is if there's a corrupt government, then companies or countries feel less obliged really to actually provide that aid if they can't see the positive impact that's happening. What's also worth bearing in mind is there's some self-interest. And I'm just going to put a question mark there. Sometimes when we look at aid, we've got to be thinking, why are governments, companies providing that aid, and where is that aid spent? Two really interesting questions that are very complex, but can really serve quite an interesting answer almost, that we need to think about what's the intentions of these companies that are investing in these, providing aid to these countries. So I'm just going to bring it back to the community care projects, and let's just have a look more specifically at one of the community projects that's been set up with international aid. Now, one of them is called the Aduan Health Centre. Which was set up in 2010. So in this area, there's a high prevalence of HIV and a high child mortality rate. We know from previous lessons that a child mortality rate or high child mortality rates are really indicative of a country with low amounts of development, or that is kind of is at the bottom of the pile and is looking towards improving. Next thing it helps to do is education on immunization. Getting people vaccinated against some of those diseases that really simply don't exist in modern developed countries, and one of them is polio. And finally, HIV testing. So finding out what proportion and who in the population is currently HIV positive. So we've got quite an interesting balanced discussion here, and of course you're being asked to evaluate. Let's just underline that. So evaluate the impact AIDS has on an NEE or LIC you studied. Well, ours is Nigeria. And if we can evaluate the impact, well, overall, I think we could say that AIDS has had a positive impact in Nigeria. When we look at HDI, Human Development Index, for Nigeria, it has extremely high growth. And a lot of that is to do with aid, and that aid helping the development of the country. One thing I think it's really important to realise, though, is that Nigeria, although we think of it as a kind of developing country, still has 100 million people living on less than $1 a day. And it receives up to about $5 billion in aid per year. So evaluate the impact. Well, whilst there has been a lot of aid going in, there are negative elements as well. And that has meant that we still have this high proportion of people living in very, very poor conditions on less than $1 a day. Okay, so if we're being evaluative, personally, I would say that there has been a high impact, especially when we look at HDI and some of these healthcare clinics, these kind of centres that are able to really serve the communities that they're in. However, some of the negative aspects, such as corrupt governments, have meant that ultimately 1 million people still live on less than $1 a day. And that would be my evaluative overall statement. Okay, obviously you need to add a little bit more for a 9 marker. If you can get in that detail and that evaluation, then that's your kind of, how should we say, stepping stone to those higher marks. Okay, as per usual, any questions, just come and find me or Mr. Sturtevant in A181, A182 on the geography corridor, and hopefully now you'll be able to go on and start to answer your 9 marker. Okay, thank you very much.